Hello, my name is Elysée Yhuel, and I'm a third-year PhD student in Trinity College Dublin in the Department of History. I'd like to thank Alexandra Corey and Sarah Allen Stacey for the invitation to speak at the Centre for Medieval and Renaissance Studies seminar. I'd also like to thank the Irish Research Council for funding my project, and finally I'd like to thank my supervisor Sean Duffy for his continual support, especially nowadays. Today I will be speaking about my current PhD project commemorating the past, the Breton Church, and its Irish element circa 700 to 1100. In the year 818, Louis the Pious, while on military campaign in Brittany, met with Matmonach, the abbot of Londonderry in Priziac. Emperor Louis had just defeated Morvan, who had declared himself king of the Bretons. There, in Brittany, driven by his recent efforts to have all monasteries in his empire adopt the rule of Saint Benedict as a means to create a unified Christian imperium, Emperor Louis interrogated Abbot Matmonach to discover what monastic rule the community was following. Matmonach confirmed they received the rule in tonsure which they used, ab Scotis, from the Irish, and that it was different from that used by the Church of Rome. Emperor Louis, in a royal diploma conserved in the life of Guenolé, declared that from thenceforth the community of Londonderry must follow the rule of Saint Benedict to conform with the universal church. And so it was done, though not exactly with ease. And here I've just included a map where you can see, obviously it's Brittany, and in the far west between Brest and Douarnenez, that's where the Abbey of Londonderry was and still is. And then further to the east where you see the other star, that's Priziac. And the reason why this is so important is because no Frankish ruler had really gone this far west into Brittany. Most of the politics and action were kind of more to the east. And then here in the next slide, I've included the diploma of Louis the Pious, included in the Cartulary of Londonderry. You can see here Ludovici Imperatoris, and scholars are debating whether this is a true copy or whether it's a forgery or not, but I won't get into that. So it's against this backdrop that my thesis examines how Breton hagiography, or saints' lives, from the 8th to the 11th century was used by Breton monks to respond to the political and religious changes that they experienced in the 9th and early 10th century. I refer to these changes as ruptures and argue that these were the impetus behind the redaction of many Breton hagiographies during this period in an attempt to create or preserve a continuity with a particular past. These ruptures included the imposition of the Benedictine rule, which went hand in hand with Brittany's integration into the Carolingian Empire, the naissance of a Breton royal dynasty, and the Viking incursions. While acknowledging the influence of the Carolingian Renaissance in Brittany, I argue that it's also no coincidence that Breton monastic writing increased significantly in the 9th and 10th century when such ruptures were at their peak. The act of choosing a particular past to reflect on and setting it in writing was an act of power, resistance, conformity, or survival. It is telling then that the past most chose to commemorate was one that was in direct conflict with the values being advanced by Louis's reforms. This past was that of the golden age of ascetics and peregrini that traveled the Celtic maritime zone, Wales, Ireland, Cornwall, and Brittany, before establishing some of the oldest monastic communities, such as Londonderry. Even more telling is the fact that Irish saints serve as models to emulate, and that motifs from Irish hagiography were incorporated in a time when Irish customs were supposed to be abandoned. It is through this threshold that I study Breton hagiography, or saints' lives, to examine how Breton monks navigated through these historical ruptures. This thesis examines the dossier of 13 saints: Guenolé, Idunet, who also goes by Ethvin, Samson of Dol, Malo, Paul Aurelian, Gildas, Gwenaël, Magloire, Ronan, Judicaël, Dudok, Brieux, and Conwayan. Using these saints' lives, I'm interested in addressing the following questions. How were Ireland and the Irish represented in a Breton context from 700 to 1100? Did monastic writings reflect attempts to reconstruct a continuity with a past intertwined with Ireland that had been broken? To what degree did the Irish influence on the Breton church affect the manner in which monks navigated through the historical ruptures that shook the continent and which potentially severed this continuity? And finally, was Breton monastic identity shaped by the spiritual ideologies shared with Ireland? We have very few archaeological and literary sources that document the ties between Brittany and Ireland. With the limited sources available, it's unsurprising that very few scholars have studied Ireland and Brittany's relations in the Middle Ages, particularly the early Middle Ages. The common thread in the historiography is the concern with establishing the historicity of the sources that refer to contacts between Brittany and Ireland, made all the more complicated given that the bulk of these sources available are not histories in the strict sense of the genre, but fantastical hagiographies. That is to say, scholars have studied Breton hagiography primarily to find tangible evidence of the Irish in Brittany, or at the very least, evidence of the Irish and Bretons interacting. Historians have certainly come far from the days when saints' lives were regarded as utterly useless, but in the study of Breton hagiography, some skepticism still remains. The overall consensus, with a few exceptions, is that the Irish-Breton connection that these hagiographies allude to were, for the most part, a fiction. This is the classic approach scholars have favored in regards to using Breton saints' lives, and it's clearly a remnant of the positivist tradition, which is concerned with sifting through these hagiographies for their historical value, even if these texts were written hundreds of years after the events they describe. These scholars have drawn very firm lines to distinguish the genre of hagiography from the genre of history, even though the Carolingians themselves did not make distinctions between the writing of saints' lives and the writing of secular history. In fact, I maintain that medieval writers recorded their past in genres that were familiar to them and suited their particular needs. Breton monasteries would have obviously been most familiar with saints' lives and would have needed a text that supplied a liturgical and didactic function, as well as one that engendered spiritual reflection. I find it much more useful to study these hagiographies through the lens of memory, which, at its simplest, is the interaction between past and present. This methodology is inspired by Maurice Halbwach, a French sociologist who formulated the theory of collective memory. Originally published in 1925, his seminal work on collective memory argued that, quote, the mind reconstructs its memories under the pressures of society, end quote, and that the present imposes constraints upon us, whereas, quote, we are free to choose from the past the period into which we wish to immerse ourselves, end quote. Since individuals are inherently social, memory too is social, so much so that a particular memory could be held by an entire group. This idea was further developed by German Egyptologist Jan Assmann, who divided collective memory into two branches, communicative memory and cultural memory. Assmann articulated the difference between the two, explaining that communicative memory is contingent on everyday interaction and has a limited time depth, whereas cultural memory depends on institutions of learning, transmission, and interpretation, is created by specialists, is celebrated on special occasions, and is formalized and stabilized in material forms. He attributed 5 key characteristics to cultural memory. 1, the concretion of identity. 2, its capacity to reconstruct. 3, formation. 4, organization. And 5, obligation. To explain briefly, cultural memory acknowledges that shared memories also have the power of creating a sense of belonging within a group. In other words, they facilitate the formation of a group identity. Halbwach believed that memory was, quote, structured by group identities, end quote, and argued, quote, we preserve memories of each epoch in our lives, and these are continually reproduced. Through them, as by continual relationship, a sense of our identity is perpetuated, end quote. Similarly, Assmann maintained that, quote, cultural memory preserves the store of knowledge from which a group derives an awareness of its unity and peculiarity, end quote. For the second point, the concept of cultural memory recognizes that the past cannot be preserved or transmitted perfectly intact, and places great importance on the idea of reconstructing the past within the reference time of the present. For formation, Assmann argued that collective memories need to become crystallized in order for transmission to take place. This can occur through the medium of written text, but also through pictorial images and rituals. Elsewhere, he emphasized the role material forms can play, writing, quote, "Themes do not have a memory of their own, but they may remind us, may trigger our memory because they carry memories which we have invested into them. Things such as dishes, feasts, rites, images, stories, and other texts, landscapes, and other lieux de mémoire," end quote. For the fourth point, organization highlights how cultural memory depends on institutionalization, which entails having specialists who are responsible for the transmission and communication of memories. And finally, cultural memory assumes that groups possess a sense of obligation to preserve these memories. The theory of cultural memory is quite appropriate for studying Breton monastic communities. The importance of memoria and preserving it in writing is a noticeable feature of Breton hagiography. Breton monasteries were groups that, under the pressures of religious, cultural, and political change ushered in by a foreign empire, now sought to recover continuity and stability from the past. These communities were institutions that had specialists, in this case scribes, who were charged with transmitting a particular history through text. Moreover, this history was continually communicated within the community, whether through reading of a saint's life during mealtimes, the celebration of a saint's feast day, or the singing of hymns dedicated to said saint. The survival of Breton monastic communities and their identity was contingent upon the constant revitalization or communication of the history of their founder saints. I stress the word history because, to the monks who wrote these hagiographies, or in some cases rewrote them, these were not merely stories to convey a moral lesson, but the history of the monastic community, the foundation upon which it was built. They believed what they wrote. Chris Rickham, along with anthropologist James Fentress, underlined this key point in their book Social Memory, noting, quote, "The question of whether we regard these memories as historically true will often turn out to be less important than whether they regard the memories as true. Groups may regard their traditions as a set of amusing stories, possessing perhaps a moral lesson to teach, but still only fictions. Yet, in other cases, groups may regard their traditions as authoritative. In these latter instances, it is important to ask how and why they do so," end quote. Breton hagiographers were keen to present their hagiographies as a faithful account, untainted by false interpolations, by imbuing them with authority. They did this by citing the Bible and works of the Fathers, referring to witnesses contemporary to the saint, and occasionally by referring to an earlier text that was no longer extant. Moreover, other than the book in which these saints' lives are contained, Breton hagiography demonstrates that these memories could also be fixed on a particular site, such as a cave into which a saint retreated, an object like a saint's handbell, or even the corpse of a saint. In short, using the lens of cultural memory to study Breton hagiography sheds light on the significance of the past Breton monks constructed and chose to give continuity to, and how they related to this past, in the process forging the identity of the community. It reveals the specific types of lives and values that they held dear, and that were perhaps discordant with the mode of life they were now expected to abide by, or simply not feasible anymore. The part that Ireland and the Irish play in these narratives demonstrates how Breton monks conceived of Brittany's shared spiritual history with Ireland and its importance to perpetuate, especially in a period when this special relationship was now vulnerable. My research is ongoing and has been affected by COVID, but I'd like to share some preliminary findings. I have divided the saints' dossiers into 3 groups. The first are saints' lives in which Ireland plays a significant role. The second group contains what I call career saints, or saints who are concerned with their bishopric. And the last group are what I call dynastic saints, saints who are a part of or somehow connected to the Breton royal dynasty. Not surprisingly, each saint's life reflects the geopolitical situation of the area in which it was created. If one considers the very early Christian landscape of Western Brittany, which seemed free from continental episcopal supervision, it's no coincidence that the saints' lives, which have a prominent Irish element, stem from monastic houses in the West. In these texts, Ireland is stereotypically presented as a land of saints and scholars. It is common for the saint, usually born in Wales, to study briefly in Ireland before going on peregrinatio to Brittany. It is considered to be the ideal spiritual landscape to travel to, although few make it there. Sometimes the hagiographers are keen to create relationships between the Breton saint and famous Irish saints, like Patrick and Bridget. Forms of asceticism, which are clearly influenced by the Desert Fathers and the Irish, play an integral role in these saints' lives. Motifs such as stone pillows, extreme diets, cross-figure, or genuflections seem to be drawn from the lives of Irish ascetics. Finally, the theme of peregrinatio features in several Breton saints' lives. Though not an Irish invention, the Irish certainly undertook and shaped the practice enthusiastically. While popular among the Bretons as well, the saints' lives show inherent tension. The fact that the practice of peregrinatio was now frowned upon was not reconciled neatly within the text. With few exceptions, these Breton saints' lives demonstrate a superficial knowledge of Ireland. From the liturgical evidence for Irish saints' cults in Brittany that exist, I argue that Breton monasteries included Ireland in their memory and rule after the 7th century. This was then formulated into a narrative which was written down around the 9th and 10th century. It is generally accepted that Irish texts made it to the continent via Brittany, and there's definitely evidence for this, but I'm starting to reconsider the role that Wales, and to a lesser extent Cornwall, played in the transmission of Irish religious customs. I hope you've learned something from this presentation, and I am happy to answer any questions or respond to comments. Thank you.